See that? My name is David Dixon. I'm a pastor at Corpus Christian Centre in the centre of Edinburgh. John has asked me to teach this course on biblical apologetics whenever I'm away for a couple of weeks in November. Two of my colleagues at the SOLAS Centre for Public Christianity, Dr. Andy Bannister and Gavin, I forget Gavin's surname suddenly, Gareth Black will be filling in those 2 weeks, and their full-time job is to be apologists. They go around the country doing this ministry full-time, and they do a great job. My journey of apologetics begins really whenever my family moved from Northern Ireland to Scotland when I was age 12. You might be aware that Northern Ireland is a very traditional place. It's like the Bible Belt of the United Kingdom. And I went from a society which was dominated by a cultural Christianity to Scotland, which was shockingly a post-Christian nation. I grew up hearing the stories about the church in Scotland, about our rich Christian heritage. But when we arrived in Scotland, we arrived into a barren land in many ways. I was the only Christian in a school of 1,000 pupils, and I was a bit of a oddity for that reason. And as a teenager, it's not easy to be the odd one out and to be an oddity. But one of the most striking things was my RE teacher. Up until this point, all my RE teachers had been Sunday school teachers on the side. But suddenly I was confronted with this RE teacher who was a hot-blooded atheist. And I have to confess to you, I wondered at the time, like, what is the point in your job? You don't believe anything. What is the point of being an RE teacher? What is the point in this? And in his classroom, I was a bit of a rare breed animal for him to poke and prod and experiment on. And one day, without any warning, he announced to the class that that period we were going to have a Grill a Christian event, and I was the Christian to get grilled by my classmates. And that was fun. that was. I think I'd been at the school 2 months at that point. So that was really quite a baptism of fire. I'm sure it's illegal as well, but anyway. The questioning, it was difficult, it was hostile, it was stretching. And yet that was the very first time in my life I experienced Jesus fulfilling his promise to us that on that day, whenever they drag you before kings and princes and put you on trial, do not worry about what you will say, because the words will be given to you in speaking. And I experienced that day, and that began me on this journey into wanting to think more about the big questions of the Christian faith, because I was going from a society and a family where it was assumed to a society where it was implausible and rejected and dismissed as already having been disproven. And I had to learn how to be a Christian, a public, open Christian in the midst of that kind of hostile society. And that is why I started to consider apologetics, because even though the Lord has promised that he'll be with us when we're put on the spot and ask questions, that also doesn't remove our responsibility to be prepared ourselves and be learning. There was one particular objection, though, that I often got asked about or confronted with in those days, early days, and that was this question about, or maybe more of a statement that they would say, you're only a Christian because your parents are Christians and they raised you that way. If you had been born in a different country, then you wouldn't be a Christian. And at the time, I found that very difficult to handle, because it was true. I had been born into a Christian family. I'd been raised in the church all my life. If I had been born in Saudi Arabia, I wouldn't be a Christian. That's absolutely true. And I didn't really know what to do with that. And I guess that takes us to the question that really animates this entire course, something which I want to help you to be able to answer. Whatever your answer is this morning to this question, I want to help you have even better answers by the end of this course. And the question is, why do you believe what you believe? Why do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, the Savior? Why have you entrusted your life and your eternity to him? Why? Why? And apologetics is partly medicine for us as Christians to help us to have more reasons to believe that these things that we already believe are true. 18 years on, well, no, what is it now? 20 years on from that day in school, in that classroom, I know now to turn that objection on its head. And that's to say to the people asking me that, saying that to me, I just have to say, well, that might be true, but it's also true that if you, Mr. Secular Atheist, had been born in Saudi Arabia, you wouldn't be a secular atheist either. So let's just accept the fact that all of us are influenced by our families and by our cultures and by the people around us. All of us are influenced in our beliefs by other people. But that is a separate issue to the question of whether or not Christianity is true. We have to separate the idea, the question of who and how we've been influenced to believe something, to the question of what reasons do we have to believe that is true? Do you see this is just there's a distinction there, and it makes all the difference in the world. And there are good reasons to believe that the gospel and the claims of the Lord Jesus are true. And that changes everything. Now, the word apologetics, it comes from this passage in the New Testament, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. You might be aware that the book of 1 Peter is a book addressed to the elect exiles, to Christians who are dispersed throughout the Roman world and who are facing a hard time. They are a minority in the midst of a dominant pagan culture. They are being persecuted. Every chapter of 1 Peter addresses the question of suffering as a believer. And they're ridiculed for their beliefs by the majority culture. Some of them are persecuted by the state at this point. But Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15, always be prepared to give an answer or defense. And that's the word apologia in Greek. That's where we get our word apologetics. Always be prepared to give an answer or defense to everyone who asks you to give a reason for the hope that you have. All of us need to be ready to explain to people, why is it we believe what we believe? What good reasons do we have to believe that the gospel is not just makes us feel good, it's a nice crutch, but it's actually true, that we commit everything in our life, and we rest everything, our hopes, our dreams, our identities, everything upon the Lord Jesus. Why is it true? Apologetics is about helping us to develop answers, defenses, reasons for our faith. Not just so that we can share that with other people, but so that in ourselves we might benefit from the confidence that we might need as we go against the flow of our culture. So that's apologetics. If you came here looking for something else, well, that's what you're going to be getting over the next few weeks, okay? Now, in this first lecture, can I make a confession to you this morning? I have in front of me 4 different talks, okay, which I have stitched together this morning for this lecture. I have never been happy in all the years I've taught this course with my first lecture. I've never been able to get it right. And so what I've instead done is I've pulled together bits and pieces. You can maybe see there's highlights here. That's a bit I'm going to use from different talks. So hopefully there will be a smooth, seamless flow of thought, but let me be really honest with you that this is actually a cobbled together lecture. The rest of them are far better than this one. But what I want to do in this first lecture is I want to give you a bit of an introduction to 21st century culture, the culture in which we live and minister, the kind of people and the way that they think, because that's important, because we need to understand the kinds of questions that people are asking today. And we have to realize that the questions people are asking today are actually different to the questions people were asking just even 10 years ago when I started doing this stuff in universities around the country. The questions have changed because the culture has been changing, and it's helpful for us to understand those changes. So what I'm going to do in the first half of this lecture is give you a bit of an overview of contemporary 21st century secular British culture and why it's like that way. I'm going to show you then how the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 17 gives us a model for how to do biblical apologetics with our culture, sharing the gospel in a way that is persuasive. Another word for apologetics is persuasive evangelism. That's all it is, really. But in the second half of today, and actually in every morning that we're together, it's going to be a bit more practical. I'm going to give you one of my talks that I've done in a number of places, in some churches, some evangelistic events, some universities. I'm going to demonstrate how to do apologetics in that talk, and then we're going to have a bit of time of Q&A. because what we normally do at these events is there's a sort of 20-minute talk and then half an hour time of open questions from the floor. And so you can save up your questions, write them down, and you can ask anything you want about the talk, about the lecture beforehand. In the Q&A time, you can be devil's advocate if you want to be on his side this morning. Don't ask me any more questions about the law, about singing, but that's the plan for this morning. As I say, the questions, we need to understand the questions that people are asking today, and the questions they're asking today are different than the questions they were asking 10 years ago. Last year, there was this Europe-wide survey that was doing the rounds in a lot of the newspapers that it was under the headline, "Christianity as default is gone." This particular study seemed to indicate that a majority of young people in 12 of the leading European countries have no religious faith at all. And it's interesting that the UK was number 5 on this list, that some 70% of our young people say they have no religious commitment. And the way that the media uses statistics like this and studies like this is they try and portray this particular story, this particular narrative. They say that as we've become more scientifically and technologically advanced as a society, then we've also become less prone to believe in fairy tales and myths about God. That narrative sort of divides the world into two. There are people who believe, and then there are people who don't believe, and they believe in, they instead base their life on science, on statistics, on experiments. They're the enlightened people, and then there are these sort of unenlightened people who believe in all these mystical beliefs and things. We're all just thrown in the one category. But this picture and this portrayal of belief and non-belief is absolute nonsense, because this diagram actually better represents the situation. Everybody lives their life on the basis of faith and reason. It's a combination of the two, rather than being a binary either or choice. You either have faith or you don't have faith, belief or science. Instead, it's actually more like a dial on your cooker that you turn to change the settings. Everybody has faith. It's just a question of what is your faith in. So it is not accurate to say that Scotland is a nation of unbelievers. Scotland is a nation full of believers. They're just not Christian believers. Scotland has changed, and also, Joel, you in England as well, in the north of England. We have changed as a society by and large from an assumed belief in Christianity, a cultural Christianity, to instead a different philosophy, a different worldview, which is essentially a religion. Some people have called it materialism, others have called it exclusive humanism, but we are very much a society of believers. People are content in our society today, by and large, to live for this here and now world. They are living for things like money, success, power, relationships, sex. They think if I have these things, then that's life. That's what I need in life. But they have no thought spurred for the things of God or the things for eternity. It's all about the here and the now. That's materialism. That's exclusive humanism, and that is by and large the default religious belief system that most people are operating with in our society today. Now, because of this change, because we've moved from a sort of historic assumed Christian culture to this new exclusive humanistic culture, in the last 10 years, there's been a sort of shift in how evangelism is done. Christianity Explored 20 years ago was an alpha. They were the sort of 2 premier evangelistic courses that churches ran. But in the last 4 or 5 years, a new course called Life Explored has been introduced. And the questions are different. They're both doing the same thing in a sense. They're introducing people to the gospel, but they've realized that people are starting much further back. They're not asking the question. Your friends who aren't Christians, your neighbors, they're not asking the question, so who is Jesus and why has he come and what does it mean to follow him? The 3 premier Christianity Explored questions. They're asking much more basic questions about, who am I? Why am I here? What am I worth? All these sorts of questions. And Life Explored is saying we've got to start further back. If Christianity Explored assumes that people are much further on the journey than they are. And so it's not picking up people, We've got to start further back. The same things happened as well. I remember at university 15 years ago, The Reason for God, Tim Keller's wonderful apologetics book came out and it was all the rage. But then about 5 years ago, Keller released a new book called Making Sense of God. And he says, the reason for this book is because my first book assumed people were over up here when actually they're back here. They're asking much more basic questions about what is happiness? What is purpose? What is identity? What do we do if what is the just and good life all about? They're asking these much more basic questions. They're not asking the questions, so how can a good God allow suffering? How can a good God send people to hell? What about God and science? Those are not the immediate questions people in our society are asking. We've got to recognize that things have shifted in actually a very short period of time. And so one of the things I want to do in this course is I want to do both of these things. I want to introduce you to and take you through the sort of traditional stuff that we cover in apologetics, the sort of traditional questions that we have to deal with: suffering, science, evidence for believing in God, and many others like that, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and things like that, the reliability of the Bible. I believe that those things are really important questions that we need to consider and think about and be able to share about. But at the very same time, I also want to introduce you to where apologetics is happening today out in the front lines, which is starting much further back and is engaging with the questions and beliefs of our society and trying to get people to think more about the gospel. A very important book, and I've put it on your suggested reading list, is Os Guinness's book Fool's Talk, which is he basically as a young man he decided he would not write a book of apologetics until he had spent 30 years doing apologetics. And so his book is really a synthesis of a lifetime of doing apologetics ministry in the public square. And Os Guinness talks about how there's sort of our two traditional pictures of apologetics in church history. There's the open hand and there's the clenched fist. And a lot of traditional apologetics is the clenched fist. It's about defending and arguing for the Christian faith. It's about answering the objections and disarming the defeater beliefs about Christianity. That's important. We're going to do that. We're going to share that stuff with you throughout this course. But then there is also, and this is where Guinness is saying, actually, we've lost this and we need to regain this, and it's the open hand. And that's persuasion, where we want to persuade people that the gospel makes better sense of life, that it's the better story that makes sense of life, and you need to consider this. It answers the questions that you are asking. It deals with the problems that you are facing in a way that no other belief system, no other worldview can. And so what we want to do in this course is we want to teach you about the clenched fist of apologetics and also the open hand of apologetics. It's very much a work in progress for me because I was schooled in and became very proficient in this stuff. And it's only been the last 5 years doing ministry out in the front lines in universities that I've realized the open hand is really important. I'm still learning about how to do that well. But I want to introduce you to lots of people who are doing it well through this course so that you can join us on the journey so you can be more effective. But it's not just Os Guinness in the last 5 years who's been talking about this. If you go back 4 centuries to the old French Christian mathematician Blaise Pascal, he says this, and this is him saying it's both. He says, men despise religion. They hate it and are afraid it may be true. The cure for this is first to show that religion is not contrary to reason. That's the fist. But then he goes on and says, next, make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, and then show them that it is. That's the open hand. I love that. If you can, I used to spend a lot of time just trying to just dump like a dumper truck. Here's a mountain of evidence to convince you that this is true. You need to take the Bible seriously. Here's all the evidence for reliability of the Bible. That's one way to do it. I often find that my reliability of the Bible talk, I wasn't impressed with it, and I found it wasn't very effective out in the field. But then I realized that actually what I need to do is spend more time getting people to the place where I convince them that the Bible and its story is beautiful. And I want to get them to a place where they say to themselves, if only it were true, if only that story was really the story of the world, and my life. Because then I can go, and here's all the evidence, here's the mountain load of evidence, and it is true. You can put your faith and trust in it. I think there's power in that. And so I'm learning. If anything, this is a course where I'm learning, and actually through teaching you and talking to you, you're going to help me learn this stuff even more. So thank you for your contributions in advance. One more story, another example perhaps just of this closed fist, open hand. Many of you will be familiar with C.S. Lewis and his books, Narnia, Space Trilogy, Mere Christianity, some of his other apologetic works. I grew up just up the road in Northern Ireland in Belfast from where Lewis's house was, and often I would walk past his statue where there's a wardrobe and Lewis opening the door looking inside. And Lewis has been a lifelong friend to me through his books and stories. I seem to bleed C.S. Lewis. People ask me questions and some are like, well, C.S. Lewis put it this way. Even though actually I disagree with C.S. Lewis and a lot of his theology, sometimes he somehow seeps out of me in apologetics. And Lewis's story is really interesting. Lewis was an atheist, hardened atheist, and his conversion to Christianity came in 2 stages. And these 2 stages map onto the closed fist and the open hand of apologetics. Lewis describes his first conversion from atheism to theism. He was basically just beaten down by the evidence that there has to be a God. If you read Mere Christianity, book 1, he talks about how he's convinced that because he realizes that the world is harsh, suffering is real, it doesn't feel right. That means there must be some sort of standard out there that says this is what's right and this is what's wrong. He says, how can I call a line crooked unless I know what a straight line is? So there must be some moral law, there must be some divine lawgiver. And Lewis describes that conversion from atheism to theism as, that night I was the most dejected convert in all of England. You're like, what? Where you didn't hear the angels singing, there wasn't great joy and peace and relief in your conversion? Lewis says, no, I was just beaten down intellectually I was forced to convert from atheism to believe in God. But I was forced. But what's really interesting is, and this is the bit of the story people often don't hear, but months later, some of his friends, J.R.R. Tolkien, read Lord of the Rings, and Dyson, another friend of Lewis's, they went on a late night walk in Oxford, and they were talking about Lewis's love of stories. Lewis was a professor of medieval literature. He loved ancient myths, medieval literature, and his friends said to him, what if the gospel is the one true myth? What if the gospel is the myth that really happened, that came true? That all the things that you hope for, the stories you love, the stories about overcoming the monster, life after death, all these wonderful stories that you love, what if all of those stories and myths that aren't true are there to prepare us for understanding the one story that is true, that fulfills all of their hopes and dreams and longings? And that idea that the gospel is the one true story that fulfills all of the stories that Lewis loved was the reason that Lewis gave his heart fully to the Lord and experienced what he describes as being surprised by joy, his autobiography. And that's there's the closed fist, there's all the reasons and arguments, but then there's the helping people to see and be persuaded that it makes better sense of all of life, and it's beautiful and it's glorious and it's wonderful. And I want to try and help you through this course to do both those things. So you got any questions so far? Just feel free to unmute yourself and speak up if you want to ask anything, or we'll keep going.
David, with reference to your previous slide on Blaise Pascal, I can see the argument there, but I think you'd have to be very careful when making it attractive that you then don't go into too worldly an area, which a lot of churches unfortunately do these days, and actually forget to bring the truth of the gospel into the argument.
That's a very valid caution, Ian, and absolutely essential point to make. And hopefully I'll reassure you as you see me modeling this that I'm not shying away from the hard things. In fact, in the next half an hour, I'm going to show you how do you present the really hard things in a way that gets through to people without getting rid of the hard things, okay? So whenever I start talking about floating stones on logs, that's about that, okay? So we'll come back to your point. It's absolutely valid and really important, Ian. We'll come back to that in the next half hour, okay?
Cheers.
Can I just ask a practical point? Just will you provide the slides afterwards?
Yeah, I should have said that, sorry. Yeah, I think it's Moodle. All of the slides and the lecture notes are in full on there.
Thank you.
So you don't have to scribble furiously and take notes exhaustively. Everything is available on Moodle. I always preferred lecturers who did that, so that's how I've also gone on to lecture. So that will all be available on Moodle straight after the class.
Thank you.
All right, we okay? So that's the introduction to apologetics and a little bit about our society. To understand our society a little bit more, it's helpful to understand the change in our society. One particular writer who you should never read. Basically, Charles Taylor, his book A Secular Age is the most important book that you should never read. It's horrific. It's 800 pages and it needed an editor. It could have been done in 300. It is horrific, but it is one of the most important books to understand what's happened in our society over the last 500 years. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to break it down, make it really simple. So you never have to ever go near this book. But Taylor's question is, how have we got from a society in the 1500s where it was basically impossible not to believe in God to a society where we now find it easy not to believe in God? And in fact, most people think, how could you even believe in God? It just doesn't make any sense. It's completely implausible. We've moved from a society where belief was inevitable to where doubt is inescapable. How has that happened here in this country, in Western society? And Taylor tries to tell that story of how we got there, and it's painful. But here's some diagrams. Taylor explains there have been really two major shifts. There's a shift, first of all, in our view of ourselves and our relationship to truth. So in the past, people, Taylor calls it, we used to be porous selves. That if you see this dotted line on the screen, there's you, a person, and you sort of had you were porous, you were open to the outside world, that there was a reality outside of you and you were open to what it had to say. There was truth outside of you, and your job, the good life, was conforming yourself to the truth out there. But the shift that has happened in the last 500 years, and it's exceptionally fast in just the last 10 years, is this one. You see that the line has gone from being dotted to being hard. And now, notice, truth was outside of ourselves before, and it was big capitals. We had to conform ourselves to truth outside of ourselves. But now, truth is locked on the outside, and our feelings are in capital letters. Now, my feelings govern everything. How I feel, how I think, that is my truth. And reality outside of me has to conform to me. And so, giving a very contemporary example, if I believe in myself that I am a little girl who has been born into a man's body, well, it doesn't matter that all of my chromosomes are XY and that I am a male in every way, scientifically speaking. Instead, my feelings tell me who I really am, and I must be allowed to change those things which are inconvenient to my feelings. And so that is where we've arrived now as a society, where we have the explosion and confusion of gender identity and transgenderism. That's just one example of what has happened when we've moved from a porous self to being open to God's truth and reality impinging on our lives, telling us actually this is who you are and what it means to be you, to a society where we have locked the doors and we are saying, no, 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 I determine what's real and true for me. It's my truth. So that's a really important shift that's taken place in our society. And it's been there's a long, complicated journey of how we got there. But that's where we've arrived today. And you've got to understand people, you've got to understand when you're engaging with people today, that we can say all we want, this is the truth, but they're like, well, I don't care, this is my truth. There's a barrier there, and we've got to find ways to get over the barrier faithfully. And I think that apologetics can help us do that. But there's a second shift that Taylor sets out, and that's a change in our view of reality itself outside of ourselves. Taylor says that we've moved from an enchanted world, a world where people believed in gods and spirits and angels and demons and all sorts of things like that. And we've moved from a sort of an enchanted world to a disenchanted world where everything is very flat. It's, well, there's the things that I can see and feel and touch and taste with my senses. There's the things that science can test, but there's nothing else. Reality is just the here and now, the things that I can tangibly touch and test. So it used to be in this diagram here, it used to be people believed that there was this world, that's the dotted line, this immanent world that we can see and touch and test. But there was also this greater reality. There is God's reality outside of ourselves. That's the ultimate reality. But what has now happened in the last 500 years is that is, just watch the shift. You see? Similar to the last diagram, but now this here and now world, that is all there is. There is nothing else. This is exclusive humanism. This is what Taylor calls the immanent frame. But there is nothing more than this here and now world that I can see and touch. And outside of myself, well, there's nothing. And this is a really significant change. People no longer think they need God to flourish in life, to live a good life. No, it's all here and now. I can figure it all out myself. Now that's why people find the idea of believing in God unnecessary today and implausible and a bit weird, because of these two cultural shifts. And this is in the air that we breathe. This is assumed in the television programs we watch, the movies we watch, the things we read. This stuff is in the air that we breathe all the time. But Taylor then helps us, and this is actually why Taylor's useful, the next bit. He recognizes that the secular person faces some problems. And it's basically that they live a lie. That you can say all you want, that all there is the here and now, and the truth is inside of me. But basically, that's just being like a child that puts their fingers in their ears, closes their eyes, says, I'm not listening, I'm not listening, I'm not listening. But it's funny how God has a way of still unsettling you, getting through to you. There's two things. Taylor says that people today are, in his phrase, cross-pressured. Like they're caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, everything seems flat, because if you don't believe in God, then you are a blob of carbon floating from one meaningless existence to another. There is no truth, there is no beauty, there is no meaning, there is no hope, there is no purpose. Life is flat, it is empty. And people find that really hard, because people actually do genuinely believe that there is such a thing as love, that there really is such a thing as justice. And so God's reality has a way of sort of imposing itself upon us. And that's this next bit, which is that people still feel haunted by the ghosts of transcendence. That there are things in their experience that they encounter and they just know there must be something more. So they're caught between a sense of flatness and these experiences, these little moments of fullness, Taylor calls it. And maybe to illustrate that, let me tell you a story about the famous poet, W.H. Auden. He lived in the 1930s and 1940s. Very, very famous poet. I don't like poetry, so his poetry doesn't appeal to me. But he's very famous. We had to study him at law school, and why we did poetry at law school, I still don't know. But anyway, Auden is very, very famous, very, very significant cultural figure. But Auden moved from, he was a liberal He was a homosexual. He was a social activist in the 1930s, and he emigrated to America. And in the 1940s, he was staying in the German Quarter. I think it was in New York, and he went to a local cinema that was showing Pathé film reels of the conquest of Poland. You remember that Hitler invaded Poland, and Warsaw was just terrible things happened in Warsaw. And Auden was watching this newsreel, and he's a man who has made a life of saying, there is no truth. I decide what's right for me. You can't tell me what I can and cannot do. That was his life. That was what he believed. That's what he fought for in society, to be freed from traditional Christian morality. But what shocked Auden in this cinema room was that as the pictures were shown on the screen of women being beaten, babies being bayoneted, the terrible things that were happening in the siege of Warsaw, some of the German people in the audience were clapping and cheering. And Auden had this moment where he realized, what I'm seeing on the screen is evil. It is wrong. But I've made my entire life and career out of saying there is no such thing as ultimate good and evil. If that's what they want to do, that's good for them. But I know what they're doing is wrong and evil. And he could not make sense of that. He realized that, no, there is such a thing as good and evil, and it's not decided by me, it's outside of me. And that set Auden off on a journey of discovery towards God. And I don't know if he ever got there. I don't know if he ever became what we would recognize as an Orthodox born-again Christian, but he certainly went off on a journey towards that, because he realized he was haunted by the ghost of transcendence, by the fact that there is truth outside of himself that he had up until that point dismissed, because he had this experience that showed him, no, you might like this because you're Germans and you think your side's winning, this is a good thing, and you hate these Polish people, but I know this is evil to do that. And one of the things that we want to do in apologetics is we want to make the most of these two things, this rock and this hard place. We want to help people to feel the tension of, if you try to live consistently with your belief that there is no God, well, that's a really rubbish way to live. That your life is emptied of everything of significance and meaning. Everything that makes life worth living, it's emptied, it's gone. It's all just it's all imaginary. And you can't live that consistently. But we also want to leverage, and aren't there things in your experience that you know are true, and they point that there is something more, that there is someone more? Things like hope. The last 6 months, 7 months of our lives, people have been desperate for hope. People have been putting up those rainbows in their house windows. They're longing for hope. There is no hope if you're a materialist. There is no God. There is no nothing outside of ourselves. It's all up to us. But no, people long for something more. Beauty, meaning. The very fact that we have minds that can think and reason, we'll think about how that's such a significant thing that shouldn't be taken for granted. C.S. Lewis talks about at one point in one of his books that if our minds are just the random movements of atoms, then why should you trust what your mind thinks? It's just like the wind blowing through the trees. But the very fact that we can think, and the only reason we can trust what we think is because there is something more that it's pointing to. Love, justice, joy. There are all these different signals of transcendence, these ghosts of transcendence that they're drawing us out and saying, no, there is something more than your flat reality without God. And the Bible would tell us that these things are actually spiritual longings. These are what Ecclesiastes calls God having set eternity in our hearts, that we are longing for something more than just this here now world. We're longing for God and for things of eternity. Through our sin, we suppress it. That's what Romans 1 talks about. No one seeks for God. We suppress the truth. And yet there are things in our hearts that reach out and long for truth. And part of what we're doing in apologetics and persuasive evangelism is we are trying to make people engage with these things. And there's loads of stuff, both from Christians. Lewis is big on this, his argument from desire. Tom Wright calls these things the echoes of the voice of Jesus. Our desires for love, our longings for justice and beauty, our sense of spiritual significance. There must be some meaning, must be some purpose in my existence. These are all the echoes of the voice of Jesus, inviting us to come to himself. There are also secular writers. Peter Berger, secular sociologist, Luc Ferry, French philosopher, and they're saying the same thing. They just don't have the answer. Luc Ferry is a fascinating philosopher because he gets to the end of his book and he says that Christianity has all the best answers that ever there have been. And he says, what does he say? He says, if only it were true. Luc Ferry gets there to the point of Blaise Pascal. You know, it's attractive to Luc Ferry, and he finishes off and says, it all hinges on the resurrection. And then he says, if only it were true. And then I'm just reading the book going, it is true. It is true. I just can't get a copy with him, but if you ever get a chance to have a copy of Luc Ferry, you could, by the end of this course, you'll be able to help him see it is true. And so there's just this this is the movement in apologetics. This is what we're finding to be a really fruitful avenue for engaging with our secular humanistic culture, to make them feel the tension. You can't live with what you believe, but you also know somewhere deep down there is something more. And let me tell you who that is and what that is. And not just that it's a nice story that makes you feel better, but it's true. And here's the reasons why it's true. That's what apologetics is all about. I also believe that's what the Apostle Paul did in his apologetics. I'm going to pause again and just ask if you've got any questions. I appreciate that this is very thick, heavy going stuff, so don't feel stupid or anything. This is actually just heavy stuff. It gets better after this. No questions. Okay, let's keep going. So Paul does this. If you've got a Bible, open up to Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17 is a fun chapter. It's also like 1 Peter 3 is the apologists' rally cry. Acts chapter 17 is the apologist's example story. And as you look at your script, your open Bibles, you'll see that the chapter begins in Thessalonica. Paul, on his second missionary journey, he's traveling through Greece at this time, and he goes to Thessalonica. He goes into the synagogue, and it says, as was his custom on 3 Sabbath days, he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and rise from the dead, saying, this Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded. Now, notice there the culture that Paul is speaking to. He's speaking to his own culture. Yes, it's overseas, but it's a Jewish synagogue. Paul is a Jew. He was a former rabbi. He knows the synagogue well. And he knows where to connect with these people. It's the scriptures. They are waiting for Messiah to come. They've been waiting, hoping in the promises of the Old Testament. And Paul's job when he goes to the synagogue is to say, here's what the scriptures prophesied. Now let me tell you about Jesus, who is the promised one who has come. He has to join them up and persuade them that Jesus is the one they've been looking for. That's what he does in the synagogue. But when you look down, if you find your head in about verse 16, Paul moves on to Athens. Athens is the capital city of philosophy, has been for the last 200-300 years. This is a pagan city. The Greek historian Xenophon tells us that the city of Athens in this time, there were more idols than there were people. This is a city full of false gods and philosophers and worldly wisdom. What's really interesting is how Paul engages and starts in an entirely different place. Let me read to you. Now, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him, and some said, what does this babbler wish to say? Others said he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. In the Greek, there it's Jesus is Isus, and resurrection is Anastasia. Do you hear Anastasia, the name? So they hear, when Paul's talking about Jesus and his resurrection, Jesus and Anastasia, the Greeks, they're hearing him talk about Jesus and Anastasia. So it's the male god and the female god. So they're confused. They misunderstand what he's saying. But then verse 19, so they took him and brought him to the Areopagus. This is the place where, this is the sort of governing council of Athens. This was the key place where philosophers and civic rulers would gather to talk and discuss and debate things. This was the forum that sentenced the old philosopher Socrates to death for his assumed heresies in philosophy. This is Paul on trial in many ways for what he's teaching in Athens. Socrates was accused of corrupting young people with what his teachings, and Paul potentially here could face the same charges of corrupting people with what he's saying about the gospel and about Jesus. So he arrives in the Areopagus and they ask, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean. Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. What therefore you proclaim as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of former ignorance God has overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, we will hear you again. So Paul went out from their midst, and some men joined him and believed, among whom were Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. Now, isn't it interesting Paul's strategy talking to the pagans in Athens? It's very different to what he did to the Jews in Thessalonica and in Berea and all of his other places that he visits on his journeys. With the Jews, with the believers, with the people who have a history of being familiar with biblical things, he starts off with where they are and he presents Jesus and says, he completes the story basically. They have a story that's waiting for a conclusion. Jesus is the conclusion. But with the pagans who don't know anything about scripture, Paul starts way, way back. And he starts actually with their culture, with the things that they believe, with their philosophers and teachers. And he builds a bridge from there to Jesus. It's very, very interesting what he does. And what I want to take you through now is, how can we be, I think that we are in a culture now which is Athens, not, well, let me be careful. You need to know your own context. There are some places in this country still where there are still plenty of people who went to church growing up who have some experience of Christianity, who have some familiarity with its teachings and truths, and they need you to complete the story. That is still here in this country, but by and large, and particularly in the circle in which I move and work in, city universities, young people, it's Athens. They've got nothing. They know nothing about Jesus and Christianity. Jesus is a swear word to them. I was once doing a thing down the hill at the primary school nearest the Scottish Parliament, and we were doing the Christmas story with SU. And one of the kids asked us, why did Mary call her child a swear word? That's where we are. It's scary. And if you're in a culture like Athens, you do not start with, here's the scriptures. You need to run up to the scriptures and to the gospel. You need to help people understand what the scriptures have got to say. And that's what Paul does here. And I want to take you through what Paul does. And there are 3 stages to what Paul does. Before I take you through them, let me tell you, you'll see on your module description sheet that I'm asking you to do in your assignment what I'm about to explain to you, okay? So pay up close attention if you're doing the assignment, because what I'm going to show you here, I want you to do. You'll see more in a minute. So Paul does 3 things. He starts with identification, and you can think of what Paul does as actually, you can think of it as moving house, getting people to move house. The first thing Paul does is he identifies with his listeners, and he says, I know where you live, here on the map. The second thing that Paul does is he says, I know where you live. It's this house here, and it's not a nice place to live, is it? Look, it's got leaking gutters. It's got holes in the roof. The windows are smashed. The door's off its hinges. It's got mold on the walls. It's really not a nice place to live, is it? He's persuading them and making them feel uncomfortable. He's helping them to see that actually where they are is not a place they want to stay. And instead he says, actually, there's this amazing new, brand new house that you could move to, which is such a much more beautiful, wonderful place. Everything you're looking for is actually to be found in this other place. And so Paul does identification, persuasion, which is most of the time that Paul spends on the Areopagus is persuasion. And then there is invitation. At the end, he lands with, and now God has appointed Jesus. Every time I'm doing any apologetics work, those are the 3 headings that I start with. I start with a blank piece of paper with the question, the issue I'm dealing with, and it's these 3 headings: identification, persuasion, and invitation. That's going to be the structure. And that's the structure I want you to practice in your assignment. I want you to choose a apologetics question or an issue in our society, and I want you to prepare a sort of persuasive evangelism presentation working through the Acts 17 model. But let me take you through actually in much more detail this model. Let's start off thinking about identification. Because what we always need to do is we need to start where people are at. We need to start with the questions that they are dealing with, the issues and the world in which they inhabit. And Tim Keller is really helpful in this. He says that when we're trying, what we're doing in identification is we're learning to express people's hopes, objections, fears, and beliefs so well that they feel as though that they couldn't express them better than themselves. Sometimes it's really tempting to do what they call, to put up a straw man and then take it down. But that's not convincing, because the people listening to you, they're like, well, I don't actually believe that. It's far more complicated than that. You haven't actually got them, you've immunized them against listening to you because you've not taken seriously what they actually do believe, the complexities of it. Instead, what you really want here is to get people on side saying, actually, yeah, that's exactly what I'm thinking about. I'm asking that question exactly. Rather than a straw man, you want the Iron Man. And then Keller goes on and says, truth should not simply be declared into a vacuum. It must be delivered as a response to the questions of particular people. And in our culture, there are lots of different stories, there are different narratives that people that form people's belief systems. There's and if you like, these are the equivalent of Paul going around Athens, looking at all the things he can see and finding the altar to the unknown God. Paul goes around, he sees all these different idols, more idols than people, but he also finds that in amongst all of the other gods they worship, there's this one altar, which is to the unknown God, just in case they missed one, it seems. And Paul sort of sees, I can use that, because you don't know about the one true living God. I'm going to use that as my way of connecting with you. And if you like, what we want to do is, as we go around our society, as we go around and get the people around us, we want to pinpoint what is their altar to the unknown God? What is their story? What is the belief system which they're inhabiting? So there's the identity narrative, which is all about being true to yourself regardless of other people's opinions and expectations. There's the freedom narrative, which says that you're absolutely free to do what you want as long as you don't hurt people. There's the happiness narrative that says that you should pursue your own happiness. You should do what makes you happy and what makes you feel good. There's the justice narrative that that on the one hand tells people, no one can tell me what to do, but also I must be passionately concerned about standing up for the oppressed, Black Lives Matter, women, minority sexual rights and justice. There's this instability on the justice narrative. Don't tell me what to do, but actually I'm going to tell you what you should and shouldn't do. There's a science narrative, which is all about that science and technology will show us how to live the good life, will help us live longer, happier lives. That's a big narrative that people put their hope in, that our lives will get back to normal once there's a vaccine for COVID. Maybe not. There's the sexuality narrative, that expressing and experiencing and fulfilling my sexual desires, that is essential to my happiness, to my well-being. And there's the history narrative, which is all the idea that history is this sort of things can only get better, that we're going to keep on advancing, making progress, and leaving religion and God behind. And Keller just talks about how these are the sort of stories that people are telling themselves. These are the stories that are celebrated in film, in songs, in books, in art. And one of the things that we want to do is we want to go through and find the things in our culture. What does this film have? Watch a film that everyone's watching, and sort of think about, what's the story this film's telling? Is it the identity narrative? So many Disney films are all about this, the identity narrative. I am who I say I am. I'm going to be true to myself no matter what others think of me. Or the happiness narrative. I'll pursue my happiness no matter what, even if it means having an affair or divorcing, leaving an unhappy marriage. Or the news, all the stuff with Black Lives Matter. It's all about the justice narrative. You want to sort of find what's the altar to the unknown God in our society, and start there. Let's talk and think about that film. Let's watch that film together. Let's talk about the themes in it together. That's what Paul does, and that's what we can do as well. So we always start with identification. Start with where people are at, the issues that they're on their minds, the questions that they're asking. That's what Paul did. But then Paul moves on to the second stage, which is persuasion. And the whole point here is to begin challenging the worldview and beliefs of our society. Persuasion is one of the things that we've lost sight of today. Well, one of the things we lost sight of in the recent past in the church, because it was easier for us because a lot of people went to church, a lot of people knew about Christian ideas and things. But now we've got to do a lot more hard work. And Paul, when he's in Athens, when he starts speaking to the Athenians, he begins to challenge them about the inconsistencies of their belief system, of their worship of idols. The Stoics, they believed, he talks about their Stoic and Epicurean philosophers who were listening to him. The Stoics, they were sort of the pantheists of the day. God is in everything, the world spirit. The Epicureans, on the other hand, were the materialists of the day. They believed in the gods, but the gods were made of atoms and stuff like us. We face the same two things: New Age, God's in everything, or materialists. Well, there is no God. There's only the here now world that we can see and touch and taste and test. We face the exact same audience today that Paul faced. And Paul begins to expose that the way they look at the world is wrong, entirely wrong. And notice that he uses their poets and philosophers against them. He quotes there in verse 28, "In him we live and move and have our being." That's Epimenides, one of the Greek philosophers from Crete. And then second quote, "For indeed we are his offspring." That's Aratus, who's a poet, an artist in Greek culture. And he's saying, there's truth in your culture, and it challenges what you actually believe and how you behave. And he's trying here to win a hearing for the gospel. He's trying to persuade people to think actually that your belief system doesn't work. Now, there are different strategies for doing persuasion. Let me give you 4 suggestions of ways to do it. First thing to realize is that enemies can be our friends. And I say enemies in inverted commas because they're not really enemies. Neighbors, pagan, unbelieving, secular neighbors can be our friends. Paul doesn't quote Amos, Moses. He quotes Aratus and Epimenides. he knows about this culture, the people, he knows about the kind of people who influence the culture in Athens and Greece. And it's useful for us to be aware of who are the leading thinkers and thought shakers in our culture as well. By God's common grace, all truth is God's truth, and even the unbelievers they do see things which are true, which we can then leverage for the gospel. Some people who I find very helpful to be familiar with their work, Jordan Peterson, many of you have heard of him. He is someone who's called him the gateway drug to Christianity. He is not a Christian, but he is helping many people begin to go deeper and get on the road that leads to God and to Christianity. He is worthwhile being familiar with what he's saying and using him to get people thinking more. Douglas Murray, again, he's a secular same-sex journalist, and what he has to say on the whole woke phenomenon is exceptionally helpful, and it lines up with biblical teaching and truth. Jonathan Sacks is an exceptionally helpful. He was the former chief rabbi of this country, and what he has to say, it's just so sad that he's so far from. He's so close, but yet so far because he hasn't got the Messiah. But he is so helpful to our society and the things that are going on. Top right, Dominion, Tom Holland. That's one of the most important books that was released in the last 10 years. And Holland has now actually become a Christian. But he's been on a journey. I've been following him as a historian for years. And he realized that even though he wasn't a Christian in belief, then everything else in his life, he was a Christian in his values. And he realized that we live in a society that owes an incredible debt to Christianity. And he really is trying to say that we need to, as a society, to survive, rediscover the importance and the goodness of Christianity and the sense of it. And then he himself has come over and actually now been converted, realizing it's true, not just useful and good, but it's true. Jonathan Haidt's a psychologist who's very helpful. And then Luc Ferry, I told you about him a little bit earlier. He's a secular atheist philosopher in France, but he's the guy who says, you know, Christianity has the stuff that nothing else has, if only it were true. These are very significant thought leaders who are very influential in our society. It's worth listening to a podcast of Jordan Peterson, worth listening to some interviews of Douglas Murray at the very least, worth being a little bit familiar with Tom Holland. They are very helpful to cite and to get people thinking, because here's this secular person who says you need to think more about Christianity. That says something. Not here's this minister, here's this Christian minister saying this, but here's a secular person who's saying this. You should think about this. That can be very helpful. Enemies can be our friends. Expose the contradictions is the next thing. Paul does this all the way through. That he points out, you know, you build these altars and houses for the gods, you feed them, but actually your own poets, they say that it's in the gods that we live and move and have our being. What are you doing? You make it sound the gods depend on you, but actually you depend on the gods. Which is it? There's these contradictions in your culture, in your society, in your belief system. It's not true. So expose the contradictions is very helpful. And this is here where we're trying to show people that you can believe stuff in your head, but you can't live that way consistently. And that means the belief in your head is wrong. It does not conform to reality. It's a lie. Richard Dawkins is great for this. He's a wee bit more of an old boy now. He's not so many people are talking about Richard Dawkins anymore. He's not so much the influential character he was 20 years ago when he released God Delusion, but he's exceptionally clear. And he's exceptionally contradictory, which is fun, which makes him useful. Because on one hand, he talks about how the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we'd expect if there is at bottom no purpose, no design, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Not a very happy life, not a very happy vision of society. Dog eat dog, survival of the fittest. It's just the way it is. Get over it, guys. Bet you though, if you smashed in his car windscreen, he wouldn't be saying, Oh, I'm just pitiless indifference, I don't mind. Que sera, sera, whatever. No, he's going to be demanding justice, and you pay. But later on, it's not even that thought, that thought experiment, imagination of smashing his window. He actually, in his later book, contradicts himself. He says, it's very important that Darwinianism, the survival of the fittest, as a system of values, is evil. It should be fought against. A Darwinian society would be a very unpleasant society in which to live. We now must use our brains to rebel against the tyranny of our selfish genes. So which is it, Richard? Do we live in a universe which is just governed by blind, pitiless indifference, where there is no good, there is no evil, there is no purpose? Or do we live in a universe where actually we should fight against evil and not just accept the survival of the fittest, where we should love the weak and the poor and the marginalized? Which is it, Richard? He's not able to live what he thinks. It's a lie. And we have to expose the contradictions. That's the second tactic, if you like, for persuasion. Another tactic is explode the assumptions. There are many things that our society, our culture takes for granted. What they don't realize is that these are Christian ideas, that no one thought this before Christianity. So Tom Holland is my go-to guy for this. He is phenomenally helpful. Holland talks about how he grew up in the church, but then the question that threw him was dinosaurs. What do we do with dinosaurs and the ark? Okay, and then he decided that he wasn't convinced by any of the answers in Genesis could give him about that, and so he became an atheist. A wee bit dramatic, eh? And he then, as a teenager, he loved reading ancient history. He loved the guts and the gore of the Romans and the Persians, and that's what all his books are about, tracing the stories of the ancient civilizations. They're exceptionally well written. But Tom realized about 10 years ago that the world of the Greeks and the Romans and the Persians made no sense to him. He realized that the world in which he lives that makes sense to him is a Christian world, a world where the strong should not prey on the weak, a world where everyone has dignity no matter of how rich they are, how powerful they are. Tom realized that he was a Christian by values, even though he wasn't a Christian in his beliefs. And that our whole society is filled with all these Christian assumptions that only make sense within the Christian religion. And so one of the things that we can help people to see is we can actually show people, you take all these things for granted. You like the fruit of Christianity, but you reject the root. But here's the thing, friends, if you're being consistent, you can't have the fruit without the root. The plant will die. And that's what's happening to our society. As we move further and further away from our Christian underpinnings, from genuine Christian belief, that is why we are facing so many of the problems that we are facing today. It is because without the root, the fruit will die. And we're only 50, 60 years into the experiment, and it's not going well. That's what Jordan Peterson is saying. It's interesting. He talks about how that Western society today is a rotting corpse because its heart is dead, and it's Christianity. Fascinating. He's not a believer, but he's saying, go back to read the Bible. He's not a believer. He's getting people to go and read the Bible. Explode the assumptions. I'm going to the little demonstration talk I'm going to do for you in a few minutes is going to show you how to do this. I don't know if well. The demonstration talk I'm going to take you through in a few minutes is going to, in a more interesting way, explain this slide. We're going to think about human rights. Where do human rights come from? Everyone takes for granted and assumes human rights, human dignity today. But actually, that's a profoundly Christian idea. It only comes from Christianity. And if you're a consistent atheist, like the boys on the right, bottom right, they'll tell you human rights is nonsense. And yet there's lots of other guys at the bottom left who are saying, actually, human rights, we don't need Christianity for human rights. But the other guys, so Pinker on the bottom left, he's an atheist, and he's saying human rights, it's just reasonable, it makes sense. But the other atheists on the right, they're saying, no, this is Christian ideas. And if we're going to be consistent atheists, we've got to get rid of it all. And then Tom Holland is saying at the very top left, yeah, these are very Christian ideas, and we need to go back to Christianity if we're going to save them from being destroyed. I'll not say more about that, but explode the assumptions is a very powerful thing. And now comes the slide that Ian's been waiting for the last hour. The last persuasion tactic is to explain hard things using ideas that people in our society already accept. I owed this illustration about floating stones on logs to Tim Keller. He talks about how if you have a hard thing to explain, a stone, what some people want to do is they want to get rid of the stone. So hell is a very hard, divine judgment and punishment is a very, very hard thing for our society to accept today. The doctrine of sin is a very uncomfortable thing for our society to hear today. And what a lot of liberal people do is they sort of get rid of the stone. They dress it up, try to hide it. We don't have that option if we're biblical apologists. But what we do have to do is find a way of getting the stone across the river to people. Now you can throw stones at people. That's traditionally sometimes what we've done. We have preached hellfire and brimstone, and we have just shouted at people and condemned people. That's one way to do it. You can throw stones. Just be careful throwing stones. Glass houses know that. Be careful throwing stones. There's a better way, I think, and it's floating a stone over the river on a raft of logs. And the raft of logs is the things that people already understand and that they already believe in, and then showing them that if you believe in this, well, actually, that's why the doctrine of hell makes sense. So I did a talk on this just last month on hell, and I was doing that. The raft for hell, if you like, is that today we live in a very judgmental society, actually, even though we're like, yeah, tolerance, and yeah, we all accept each other. Actually, we're a very judgmental society. Just go on social media. You'll see it being lived out. We're also a society that's full of activists fighting for social justice, who want to see the world made a better place, who are passionately concerned for justice and right prevailing. People who aren't afraid to call it evils. Systemic racism is one of the things people talk a lot about. Sexism, all these different things that they see, these are evil, but we've got to take out these things. And what you can do is you can say, well, look, you care about justice, but God cares about it even more than you do. And it's because God cares about justice that something has to be done about evil in this world. And the problem is that evil is not just out there. It's not just in other people, but there's evil lurks in all of us. The old Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in his famous book, The Gulag Archipelago, describing his experience in the Gulag during the Soviet regime, talks about how, if only it were so simple, that somewhere out there, there were these evil people committing insidious acts, and all we had to do was get them together and kill them, and that solved the problem of evil. But the problem of evil is much more difficult than that, because the line between good and evil cuts not through nations, not through political parties, not through social classes, but right down the middle of every human heart. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? You see, evil is not just a problem, friends, out there with other people. Evil is a problem in here with you. That there is a gap in all of us between our ideals and the realities of our hearts, isn't there? We all know that. We hide it. We don't show it on our social media profiles, but it's there. There's this gap. There is evil that lurks within all of us. All of us are responsible in our own small ways for all that's wrong in this world. And God, if God is going to deal with evil, then he has to deal with you and me. And suddenly hell starts to make sense to people. That hell, if God is going to make this world new, something has to be done about evil. It has to be expelled from God's world so he can make it new and not destroy it anymore. And hell is the place where it's contained forever. We can no longer destroy. The bad news is that we are all destined for that place, because evil is within all of us. So we can't destroy it and rid it from ourselves. But the good news is the gospel comes along and it says there's a way that God has made to deal with the evil in your heart and to pardon your sins so that you might be spared from that fate. So it is possible to preach hell in a way that makes sense to people. If you take the hard stone of hell and you float on a raft of logs and you begin talking into the things that already make sense to people in our society. So You can do that for all sorts of things. I did it on Sunday night. They were dealing with the question: is Christianity sexually repressive? How do you float the hard stone of no sex outside of marriage? The Bible teaches, and only between a man and a woman in the covenant of marriage. How do you float that stone in this society across the river without being called a bigot or whatever else you want to be called? Well, we'll come to that later in the course. We'll actually be doing that, so we'll show you how to do that. And hopefully through a lot of the demo talks I'll do over the weeks ahead, hopefully you'll learn strategies and ways of floating hard things across the river. Well, that's all persuasion. So those are 4 tactics that you can use for persuasion, and Paul spends most of his time in Athens persuading people. But the last thing, and we must never lose this, because our job is not to win arguments with people. Our job is, an apologist is a persuasive evangelist. The goal is always to present the Lord Jesus and the good news of his gospel to people. We want to get that through to people. Keller says that this last stage, invitation, having confronted, we now console, showing them that what they're looking for can only be found in Christ. Put another way, we show our listeners that the plot lines of their lives can only find a resolution, a happy ending in Jesus. We must retell the culture's story in Jesus. What I've done, I've got a series of talks going through. I remember quite a while ago, we looked at the sort of 7 cultural stories Keller identifies in our society, and I've got a talk on each of those. Some of them I'll give you in the coming weeks. But when it comes to the identity, the identity narrative, I have my gospel invitation is about the story of Nicodemus, a man who has built his identity on what he knows and what he's done. And Jesus says to him, the best of the best, the smartest of the smart, you must be born again if you're to see the kingdom of God. That's that gospel link that I've used before. When it comes to the freedom narrative, I've gone to the story of the demoniac, the man who has the legion of demons within him, who has got to that place because he's opened himself up. He's indulged himself in his freedoms, thinking I'll be free if I just go and live and do whatever I want, open myself up to all these things. But actually he was becoming a slave and a captive. And how Jesus sets him free, but Jesus can only set him free because Jesus was willing to become a captive and a slave himself and be bound and then killed. So the man was in the place of the dead. He lived among the graves while Jesus went to the grave to set us free. The happiness narrative, the woman at the well, that's what I was doing actually just on Sunday night there about the sexuality narrative, the woman at the well. Justice narrative, the woman caught in adultery in John 8 is a great story for the justice narrative. Science, John 1, and in a few weeks I'll do that talk for you, and I'll take you to John 1. There's the introduction to John's Gospel, Jesus being the Logos. That's a wonderful passage for the science progress narrative. The history narrative, I've gone to the parables about the kingdom and the parable of the wedding feasts in particular. And I think I'll be doing that one with you in a few weeks as well. So Paul in Athens, his invitation in Athens, Paul understands the story behind the altar to the unknown God. Years before, there had been an outbreak of a plague in Athens, and the people thought the gods are angry as we've somehow failed to worship the gods. One of them's angry as has sent this plague, so we have got to find a way to appease the god to make the plague stop. Problem is, which one? Gods don't talk, so how do we know which god to appease? So one of the priests, I think in different tellings it's chickens, in another telling it's sheep. But the priest does some razzmatazz with some sheep or some chickens, sets them loose, and they follow the sheep around Athens until they come to a spot and they start either eating the grass or pecking the ground, and they say, right, they were hoping it would lead to one of the altars of one of the gods, and they would know that's the god to appease. But instead, the sheep or the chickens start eating the ground, and they think, oh, we don't know who this god is, so we'll build an altar here on this spot where the sheep or the chickens have stopped, and we'll dedicate the altar to the unknown god, and we'll make an offering, and the plague will stop. Well, they didn't know about epidemiology. They didn't know about curves and all this stuff that we know about in the last 6-7 months of our lives. But the plague, herd immunity, that phrase, it was reached in Athens. The plague stopped, but they still have this altar. The story of the altar is the gods are angry. and we have to appease them. And Paul says, God is angry at your sin. Your idolatry, God is angry at that. And there's a judge who's coming to judge you for your sin and your idolatry. But the good news is that the judge can also be your savior, the one who's endured the judgment. I know Paul doesn't say this in Luke's summary, but I think this is what Paul was doing. But the judge can also be your savior because he's the one who's endured your judgment on your behalf, so you might be saved. So you see how Paul resolves the story. He's identified the story. He's identified the way in, the altar to the unknown God. He persuades them that all of your idolatry doesn't make any sense. It's incoherent. And then he resolves the story with Jesus' invitation. There is, yes, God is angry at your sin and your idolatry, but God is also not just appointed a judge, but a savior. That's how Paul does apologetics. That's how I do apologetics. That's how Tim Keller, Dan Strange, so many other good friends do apologetics. And hopefully we're going to show you how to do it through this course. And we're going to get you to do an assignment where you're going to practice having a go at it yourself. So you've been very patient. And it's 12:30, my goodness. Do you want to ask any questions at this point?
It's been a lot to take on board.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It's been very interesting though. Really enjoyed it.
It's all recorded, so you can go back and listen to it. There's the notes there. And
I don't know where I've come across Tom Holland, but I recognized his name. So
there's the film star Tom Holland, who's not this Tom Holland.
Well, maybe that then. But no, I think I recognize it as an author name rather than a...
He's very famous in this country, particularly. Tim Keller put a review of his book a few weeks ago saying this is the most important book in the last 10 years. So,
which book was that?
That's Dominion.
Have you updated this book recently, or is it just, is that me getting it wrong?
Douglas Murray just updated Madness of the Crowds recently. That was doing the rounds in the last 2 weeks. He's written an update to Madness of the Crowds after the Black Lives Matter summer that we've had.
Okay, but Dominion's not been updated. No.
Not that I know of. No.
Sorry.
Fire away, Peter.
No, it's exciting, just see the framework you've got there. I mean, I can see myself with friends and family and people I talk to, and I get the identity, maybe even the persuade, then I feel at the invitation bit, and even the persuasion bit. I can see where I'm failing, I mean, there's that many people I come across now, and I'm trying to witness to in a sense, and I can get frustrated. I can throw bricks, throw stones or whatever, right, just to shut them up. I'll just say, I'll just take that then, right? A couple of hand grenades, right, and walk away. But when I see it there, I've got to get to the invitation bit, the persuasion bit, and it's actually quite exciting for me, that, because in a sense, I sort of gave up on it a bit, I just do, here we go again, I know where I'm going to get hit the barrier in a sense, you know what I mean? And yet I'm reading that and I'm excited because I'm thinking it doesn't have to be like that, you know what I mean? There's a chance to actually, and you see using Paul's model and bringing everything that's today, because I mean at the root of it, everybody's confused anyway, aren't they?
Yeah.
And we're the only ones with the real answer, so we shouldn't be disheartened, should we really?
And don't be discouraged. Don't be saying, I failed to do that. I failed to do this. Don't get disheartened. For a start, I've no doubt made this harder than it needs to be, more complicated than it needs to be in this lecture. I'm just trying to explain a lot to you. But the simpler you can do, if just keep in your minds, it's just that simple illustration of, I know where you live because I've lived there too. I know the neighborhood really well. And isn't it a nasty place to live? Look at all the things that we don't like. But I've also discovered that there's a place up the road to move to, and it's a wonderful place. Let me tell you about it. That is all this is, okay? Just I'm going to give you a talk in a minute, okay? And I'll level you guys. I work primarily with educated university students in that sort of setting, and so I have to work at that level. But you can do this a lot more simply than that. And if anything, I'm going to stretch you a wee bit through this course, but you can bring it down. And I don't want to discourage you. I want to give you some models. I want to give you some ideas. I want to give you lots of different things that you might be able to take and use in your own ways. But do not think you've got to do what I'm doing in the way that I'm doing it, talking to the people who haven't read the things that I've read. That's what I've had to do. That's the calling I've had from the Lord. It's painful. Reading Dominion by Holland, it's a painful slog of a book. A lot of the books that I read are painful slogs, and I read them because I know I need to do it. God gave me this mind to do it, and I just have to go on with it. I often tell people in church, I read these books, you don't have to read them. So I'm trying to synthesize and give you the good stuff, saving you quite a lot of the pain. But please don't be discouraged and think, well, if I can't do that, or if that seems too hard, then this is not for me. That's not true. You can do this. You can say to people, I know where you live. I live there too. And look at all these things. Or at least here's one thing. This is a real big problem. But isn't it amazing to? I find there's a much better place to live. You can do that. Please keep that in your minds. Let me we've got only a little bit of time left, so let me quickly switch over the PowerPoint. Take you to a talk that I've done now a couple of times, titled Am I Matter or Do I Matter? And this is the talk I was sort of mentioning earlier about the one about human rights, human significance and human value. I last gave this talk at Glasgow Strathclyde University in February, when the world seemed normal. Seems like a long time ago. But anyway, here we go. Let me take you through this talk. It'll be a little bit quick, but watch out for when you're listening. Watch for identification. Watch what I'm doing in persuasion, and you can't miss the invitation. Okay, just see this as a model, be an example, being an example of this being done in real life. And you don't have to do this the way I do it, but it's just a model, an example, and it will hopefully just give you a few things. So if you're having a conversation, next time you're having a conversation with someone and you start talking about human rights or anything like that, or just human value, and maybe there'll be one thing you remember from this that you can use in that conversation. Please listen to it with that kind of mindset. I remember slides and stuff is available on Moodle. You don't have to scribble lots. So a few years ago, Robbie Williams released a feel-good song, I Love My Life. It goes, I am powerful, I am beautiful, I am free, I am wonderful, I am magical, I am me. It's a wonderful thing to feel that you are significant, that your life is worth something, that you have dignity and potential. In fact, it's necessary for our mental well-being that we have a sense that our lives matter. But the question is, where does that value come from? And is everyone's life equally valuable and worth living? Our default way to answer questions like that in our society is to point to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which celebrated its 70th anniversary last year. In its preamble, it announces that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. But here's the crucial question. How do we know that that statement is actually true? The Declaration just states this as a fact, but it gives no reasons or evidence for that belief. Where does our human value come from? Upon what foundation is it built and secured? Well, interestingly, researcher Nick Spencer in his book, The Evolution of the West, points out that the Declaration of Human Rights was shaped by the influence of the French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain and the Lebanese Christian diplomat Charles Malik. And it was on the basis of the Bible and the example of Jesus Christ that they said that human rights exist, that they are not just convenient myths that we have invented for ourselves, but rather they are realities that we have discovered in the moral fabric of the universe. And today I want to share with you why I believe that the Christian story, the Christian worldview, has a better answer to the question, what am I worth? and especially helps us if we struggle feeling that our life is not valuable, or if people treat us as if we are not as valuable as they are. To help you see that, I'm going to begin by contrasting the Christian story and worldview with the prevailing secular story and worldview. It tells us that we are matter. At the start of his best-selling book, Stephen Hawking, in A Brief History of Time, tells this story. It's about a well-known scientist who once gave a public lecture on astronomy. At the end of the lecture, a little old lady at the back of the room got up and said, "What you've told this young man is rubbish. The world is really a flat plate supported on the back of a giant turtle." Well, the scientist gave a superior smile before replying, "And what is the turtle standing on?" The little old lady replied, "Ah, you are very clever, young man, very clever. But it's turtles all the way down." Now, it's a bit of a weird but funny story, but it does make a serious point that we believe, all of us believe in some ultimate reality that goes all the way down, that supports everything else. For an atheist or humanist like Stephen Hawking, that ultimate reality is matter and energy. Human beings are the product of time, chance, and natural selection. We're matter. That's it. Nothing more. With characteristic directness, the atheist scientist Richard Dawkins has summarized the implications of this belief system. He says the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we'd expect if there is at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. We are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. What he is saying is that human beings have no greater value or purpose beyond survival and reproduction. But here's the problem, here's the dilemma. If you follow that line of thinking consistently, then you will struggle to explain why all human beings have inherent dignity, value, and rights. For example, it's not just me who thinks this, but John Gray, one of Britain's leading atheist philosophers, argues that our beliefs in humanistic values and human rights, they are really just a secular version of Christianity. He says that if we're being really consistent atheists, that we would admit that human beings have no greater worth than a slime mold. While many people try to dismiss John Gray as being pessimistic, I actually find he's just exceptionally consistent. And all attempts to find an alternative basis without God for our values have failed. Let me take you through 3 examples. Some people say, well, the reason why human beings have human rights is because we have special characteristics. We are intelligent, and that means that we deserve special treatment, special value. But the problem is that any characteristic that you use to separate human beings from animals will not just separate humans from animals, but will separate some human beings from other human beings. For example, what do you do about a person who is mentally handicapped or who is below average intelligence? Does that mean that they have less value, that they deserve less protections and rights because their special characteristic intelligence is less than the average person? This is not a theoretical problem. The leading British ethicist, Peter Singer, argues that we should be doing medical experiments on people who are mentally deficient rather than on animals. He says that talking about human rights is a form of speciesism, like racism, just about species. He thinks that dolphins have more rights to live than a newly born human infant. No, special characteristics doesn't help us. Another possibility is that state powers is the reason why we have human rights. There are those who argue that it is the state that has granted its citizens these rights and protections. But there's a huge problem here, because if our human rights are something a past government has given to us, what is to prevent a future government from taking them away from us? What if they were to take away the rights of a minority group in society with the approval of the majority and enslave them or eradicate them? What if the old in our society are too big a drain on the National Health Service? What if what if the young people rise up and say, no, we don't want to pay their pensions anymore. Let's just wipe them all out. Save us a lot of money. Pay less taxes. No, you see, if the state is the origin of our human rights, then the state can also be the termination of our human rights. The majority can become a tyranny. That won't help us. There's a third option. There are those who say, well, human rights, they're just self-existent. Just as there are scientific truths about the world, just as there are mathematical truths like 2 + 2 = 4, there are also moral truths that just are there. They just are the way they are, like human beings are valuable and to harm them is wrong. We can't explain these convictions other than we just know that they exist and we need them to exist. But I have a better explanation for why we all just know that human beings are valuable, that we shouldn't do harm against them. I believe the better explanation is the fact that we live in a universe of physical laws and moral laws, because those are the fingerprints of a divine lawgiver. And that takes us to an alternative worldview, which is not the secular worldview, it's the Christian worldview. The secular worldview says you are matter, but the Christian worldview says you are loved, and that's why you matter. According to the Bible, we live in a universe that is love all the way down. The ultimate reality is the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit united in love. This God of love created the heavens and the earth and holds them in his everlasting arms. The masterpiece of his creation were human beings made in his image and likeness. Human beings are not just matter, they are loved by this God. But maybe you're thinking to yourself, well, that sounds good, but maybe it's too good to be true. How do you know that that's really true? Well, I know it's true because God has not just spoken to us in the pages of a book, the Bible, but he's also stepped into human history in a person called Jesus Christ. And Jesus proves that all human beings are precious in the sight of God. When you read through one of the shortest biographies of Jesus, the Gospel of Mark, for example, you'll see him interacting with all sorts of people, making the marginalized the center of his attention, making nobodies into somebodies, touching the untouchables, defending the powerless, speaking up for the voiceless. Every single human person mattered to Jesus and was treated with dignity by Jesus. And so briefly, I want to look at a story about Jesus recorded in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus meets two very different people. One is a young 12-year-old girl who is dying. The other is a woman who has been sick for 12 years. In the first century, neither women nor children were socially significant. They were the property of their husband or their father. Now, the child is the daughter of a VIP, Jairus, in town. And Jairus is racing against the clock to get Jesus to come back to his house before his daughter dies. Maybe he wished that he could have invented blue lights, flashing blue lights and a siren for an emergency like this. There's not a moment to spare, but the streets are packed with bodies, crammed with people going about their daily business. It's very difficult to press through them. But there in that crowd that day, there was a second person, a woman who was socially ostracized because people feared that her sickness was contagious and might contaminate them as well. She desperately wants to be made well. She knows that Jesus has healed countless other people. But after 12 years of nursing a wounded heart, of rejection, of having been the plaything of many other doctors and treatments, maybe she feared that Jesus wouldn't have any time for her. But as Jesus passes by in this packed crowd, she anonymously reaches out her hand to touch his coat. For 12 years, she's seen countless doctors try to retreat her on the market, but nothing has worked. And yet in that one moment of faith, with one touch of Jesus, this woman was healed. Suddenly, Jesus stopped in his tracks, insisted to know, who has touched me? He leaves this woman with no choice but to reveal herself. And upon stepping forward, Jesus tells her in the hearing of everyone in town, daughter, your faith has healed you. Now, Jesus didn't have to stop and talk to her, but he deliberately stops and talks to her because after all of these years of suffering and rejection, Jesus wants her to know that she is daughter in the sight of God, that she has a heavenly Father who loves her and cares for her as one of his children. And far from embarrassing her in the view of everyone in town, instead, Jesus is publicly certifying that this woman has been healed. He has removed her social stigma. He has made a way for her to be reintegrated into the community. But all this time, remember, Jairus is anxiously standing by. But then things take a turn for the worse. One of his servants runs up to Jairus with a message. Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the rabbi anymore. And this is every parent's worst nightmare come true. But then Jesus reaches out his hand, touches Jairus' shoulder and says, do not be afraid. Believe, and she will be healed. Jairus had believed that Jesus could help if he got him home before his daughter died. But now Jairus is going to learn that Jesus can still help after she has died. Upon arriving at the house, Jesus goes upstairs into the little girl's bedroom. And then, just as if she had gently woken from a deep sleep, we read that he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." At that moment, her eyes opened, she gasped for breath, her heart resumed beating, and she sat up, very much alive again. And then again, showing Jesus' sensitivity to people's needs, Jesus encourages her to have something to eat. Now, I wonder, did you see it? Did you see how Jesus treated these women with extraordinary countercultural kindness and dignity? But Mark wants us to see something even more significant, that Jesus has saved these two people from the two greatest enemies to human flourishing, sickness and death. Jesus did not just come to be a good Samaritan, to be a social justice activist, to be a good humanitarian. Jesus has come to save human beings from the deepest problem that lies behind all of our sicknesses and ultimately the problem of death. These are just symptoms of the deeper problem. Remember, human beings have been made in the image and likeness of God. We enjoy great dignity and honor. But the Bible also records the bad news that we all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We have failed to live up to our God-given privileges and responsibilities. Instead, we have descended into sin, which has separated us from the God, the giver of life. All of us instead are like cut flowers. We're slowly wilting, fading, and dying, for the wages of sin is death. That's the primary reason why Jesus came into this world. Not to reform human society, but to reconcile sinful humanity with the God of life and love. But for that reconciliation to take place, something had to be done about our sin and our shame. And that's why Jesus came and died. The Bible tells us, for God demonstrates his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Jesus died for us. The cross of Jesus Christ answers our question today, what am I worth? It shows us that in God's eyes, we are not just meaningless matter. Rather, we are wonderfully loved. No matter who you are, no matter what you have done or had done to you, Jesus can change all of that, if only you would invite him in. So the question we'll have to finish with today is, does Jesus matter to you? Because you can be sure that you matter to him. All right, there you go. This will stop sharing. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you all. You guys need to do some talking now and tell me thoughts, reflections, any questions you have. Comments.
I can see it's been very useful for working with a lot of my family, because they come from very different ideologies. My nephew is an actor. I've got brother-in-law into various sexuality things, and another brother into Hinduism and stuff, brother-in-law into Hinduism and stuff like that. So yeah, very, very diverse, and all in these special minorities that are protected in this day and age. And if you speak against them, you are hatred and the bigot and stuff like that. So all have to be dealt with very sensitively, which is very, very difficult because they just shut you down straight away as soon as you try to address it.
Well, when Andy comes in November, he's going to be doing the topic about just how do we communicate with people who are like people of different religions, like Hinduism. He'll focus particularly on Islam, which is Andy's PhD. But that he'll also pick up just how do we communicate in a way that gets to people who like your family member who's into Hinduism. And then I think 2 weeks after that, we'll get to look at the ones about sexuality and all those things. And so hopefully November will help you with those particular, give you some fuel and help for those people in your life.
Tone of voice. Just I'm conscious that the human rights issue, particularly Black Lives Matter and that sort of thing, is a very emotive topic at the moment. And there's a little bit of a mob mentality or a lot of a mob mentality out there. How would you go about it in a tonal point of view, just speaking with people? And then the second thing I wanted to ask was, obviously that was a talk that you would do at a designated time, you'd be asked to do a talk. How would you make that more conversational? If you were chatting to someone, say in the office or whatever it might be, how would you?
Yeah, probably a lot less quotes. I think the model, I think what's helped me is being forced to do the talks has just over the last 10 years forced me to just imbibe the model, and that comes out in conversations. I don't think we're going to cover this in the course, but I always, my summary, this is from what I told you about friends, enemies can be friends. One of the books that there was a psychologist called Jonathan Haidt. On the SOLAS website, you can get an article that I wrote summarizing Haidt's work and why it's useful for us in evangelism. But Haidt would tell us that we should always lead with love. That's identification. Identification is leading with love, taking time to understand people, listen to people, understand where they're coming from. And tying that into your Black Lives and sort of weaving it all together. Peter, you had two nice clear, I'm just going to muddy the water and blend them all together. But when it comes to Black Lives Matter, you've got to distinguish between the political movement, which is toxic, dangerous as an organization, and the genuine problems that there are with race relations in our society and the felt pain that there is there. And so always lead with love, always identify. Because if you jump in at persuasion, let me tell you why you're wrong. That shuts down the conversation, that's over. When you start asking questions, that's it in conversation. Asking questions is Andy will almost certainly talk about this, but one of the most powerful things an apologist can do in personal chat is ask questions, and that's about identifying, understanding. And then once you have found the way in, you can begin to do some persuasion, and you might still be just doing questions, but have you thought about this and why do you think that? And Andy has a great talk you can get on the SOLAS website, how to talk about Jesus without sounding like an idiot. And it's all about just using questions in your personal interactions. I'm not going to do the Black Lives Matter talk that I did in June, just when it was all happening. But I'll put up the PowerPoint just so I'll just show you, and because I'll show you the identification and what we did. And if I remember starting off, it was really just looking at the George Floyd story and just drawing out just the sadness of it. Right, let me share my screen. So weigh in. Let's just think about the George Floyd story and what happened, and just what a horrible way to die, and just a horrible thing to happen. Thinking about the movement and the questions and the points that they're raising, then talking about how there's a history of a problem of slavery in America, particularly. There's this problem that they've had since their founding. The Bible also talks about slavery, and some people raise the question of, does the Bible then justify and condone slavery because it doesn't call for the slaves to be set free explicitly? But then to help people to see, actually the Bible sets up a trajectory where what it teaches us it basically lights the fuse that one day will blow up slavery. And so you got this picture from William Wilberforce in his campaign for the abolition of the slave trade. Am I not a man and a brother? That is from Philemon. That's New Testament, New Christianity. Paul lived within slavery, but he also lit the charge that would blow it up. So if we're against racism, if we're against slavery, then we will find in the Bible and Christianity an ally to help us in that cause. And just talking about how actually when you compare it with other civilizations, slavery was, some people were born to be kings and some were born to be tools. That was Aristotle. The Greco-Roman world was a horrific place. It was only in Christianity that slavery was condemned as a moral evil, an affront to God that must be abolished. And then just show actually the worldview that the Black Lives Matter movement propagates doesn't have the answer. If they're consistent, no lives matter, or only some lives matter than others, and actually go through like Darwin, look at the subtitle of Darwin's great book on evolution, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Atheism is no friend of race relations and equality of people. The atheistic worldview is no friend. There's Doug Murray, there's Dominion, but there's a deeper philosophy today behind the secular worldview, which is driving all the stuff with Black Lives Matter, with transgenderism, with LGBT rights. And it's this thing called critical theory. It's all about the oppressed and oppressors. It's all about power, and it's no way to live. It's not a good thing. And then I engage with some of the key leading, like these books were on Amazon. They were the #1 bestsellers over the summer. And just trying to then expose why the secular world doesn't have the answers. It has all these problems, doesn't solve the problem, makes the problem worse. But the biblical answer has the better answers. It says Black Lives Matter because all lives matter to God. And then basically we did the talk very similar to what the talk we just did there about all lives matter. Yes. So anyway, you can get that talk online. You can go on you can go on to our YouTube page, Grubbers, and you can watch that talk. It was from the first Sunday of July. If you want to watch that talk and just see how I dealt that, you can watch the Q&A I did afterwards live. That was one of the worst Q&As I've ever done. It was way too political because the questions were horrifically political. I wrote on our staff WhatsApp afterwards, oh no, I'm just going to go and find a hole and die or something after that Q&A, and someone drove over with some ice cream. But it was fun. Looking back, it was fun. If you want to think some more about that topic, go on and watch the talk. But it's identification, it's persuasion, using their sources against them, and then it's presenting the better story the gospel brings. And when it's personal chat, questions, but you're always doing the same thing: identification, persuasion, and then sharing Jesus. Sorry, a really long answer, Peter.
All right, thank you.
Got 2 more minutes. Is there anything else anyone wants to ask? Joel, you look like you want to say something.
I suppose like a lot of the people I speak to, sort of my age, sort of probably have quite liberal politics. So when a lot of the books like Douglas Murray and what's his name, Jordan Peterson, I sort of find some of the stuff interesting, but it is sort of associated with like right wing.
Yeah.
So I just sort of, do you find there's a danger in sort of, I don't want to associate Christianity with a political leaning, do you know what I mean?
Really important.
How to sort of tread around that. Yeah.
So the way to do that is that to use sources on both left and right, and you're critiquing both. So on that list, there are the conservative guys that you just mentioned, Doug Murray and Peterson. Height as though a liberal, and so is Furry, and others who I'd add to the list would be on the left. When I was doing the Black Lives Matter talk, almost all my sources, bar Doug Murray, were on the left. They were actually the people who are calling for like some of the big books, which are like White Fragility, why I no longer talk to white people about racism, and they're all very on the left. So it is important, Joel, that you don't just read your own echo chamber.
Yeah.
The way I approach apologetics, the way I work is partly because of my training, which is in law. And I learned in law it's important to look at an issue from different angles. There's a proverb about that. It talks about how one person says something and it sounds right until you hear the other side. That's my life. I read a bit like, oh, this is the answer, but then I read the other side. Oh, a bit more complicated than that. A bit like COVID skepticism right now. I'm reading lots of stuff like that. It's lots of skeptics thinking like, oh, but there's this other side. Oh, I don't know what to think anymore. It's important to expose yourself, what I'm saying there, Joel, to both sides of that. And when you're dealing with people who are more left-leaning, use their sources, use their poets, use their philosophers, use their commentators, but show where there are the problems. And actually reading the guys on the right will help you see where the problems are. You don't have to mention the guys on the right, but you can then sort of use the sources on the left, but just point gently where the problems are. So it's just about being informed. It's really important. You're really right to be wanting to ask, how do we avoid associating the gospel with one political platform? Because it's way beyond that, and it critiques both. The famous German atheist Friedrich Nietzsche said, "God is dead, we have killed him." And he then has this incredible poetry where he talks about how will we now live whenever we have pulled the stars down from the sky. And he talks about how we're almost disoriented now, that there is no longer up or down. There is only left and right. Without God, there's just power, battles over power. We're not playing culture wars. The gospel and apologetics and evangelism is not about playing at the culture war. So we have to, as you're rightly pointing out, be sensitive about what we're heard to be using as sources lots if we're speaking to people. But it is important that we would be familiar with the other side.
And just on that, is it helpful to agree sometimes with some of the points that maybe the liberal side are doing? There might be some good things within it. We don't agree with the main principles, but they might be saying truth or good thing. Is that a good way to do it? Open yourself up for discussion? Or
Paul does that. He says, your poets, they're right. In him we do live, move, and have our being. They're right, but you're wrong here. Because they're right, you're wrong. And so the Black Lives Matter situation, racism is wrong, and it is a problem. And to acknowledge that and to be heard to acknowledge that
opens up.
Really important, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, we're over time, so thank you so much for your working hard this morning. I promise next week will be a bit easier. Who wants to pray for us? Jill, will you pray for us?
Yep. Father God, we thank you for this time we could have together, and we thank you that we have such good news to share with people. And I pray that as we do these lectures and look into this course, that you would just teach us more and more how to share that with others, and that you give us opportunities to do that, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, David.
Have a good week. Go lie down in a dark room, cup of tea, have some biscuits and chocolate will help. God bless you all. Bye-bye.